My name is Corbin Weller, and if you had asked me 2 years ago what my life would look like today, I would have told you about Sunday pancakes and movie nights, about the sound of her laughter in the kitchen, and how we'd grow old side by side. I would have said we were solid, not perfect, but good. Real. The kind of relationship built slowly, day by day, like a house with thick walls and deep roots. But the truth is, I've been living in an empty house long before I ever walked out of it. Lorna used to be the kind of woman who made the smallest things feel cinematic. She'd sit barefoot on the porch in the morning light, cradling her tea with both hands like the mug was part of her. She used to talk to me with her whole face, eyes, hands, eyebrows dancing. There was music in the way she moved through a room, and I fell in love with it. All of it. I didn't just love her, I loved being around her. But somewhere along the way, that music faded. And I didn't notice at first. Not really. It started subtly. A missed text here, a cold shoulder there. Less laughter. Shorter hugs. She began wearing that far-off look more often, like she was somewhere else even when she was sitting right beside me. We stopped asking about each other's days. Meals became quiet. The couch between us grew wider, even though we sat the same distance apart. And I kept telling myself it was a phase. A tough season. That maybe work was draining her, or stress, or just life. I gave her space, thinking she'd circle back. I softened my voice, watched my words. I adjusted, compromised, waited. But she didn't circle back. She kept drifting. And I kept pretending. There's this particular moment I replay more than I care to admit. It was raining. A quiet Saturday. We were standing by the window. I said something, I don't even remember what, but she turned to look at me with this expression that gutted me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was detachment. Like she was looking through me. Like she was watching the rain, not hearing me speak. And that's when I knew, not suspected, not feared, but knew that she wasn't mine anymore. She didn't have to say it. I felt it in the pause before her words, in the weightless silence that followed. I don't know when exactly the betrayal happened. Maybe it wasn't a night or a kiss or a hotel key. Maybe the betrayal was slower than that. Maybe it was every time she looked at her phone and smiled at someone else's name, or every time she chose not to reach for me in bed. Maybe it wasn't about cheating in the traditional sense. Maybe it was emotional. Maybe it was spiritual. But I'll tell you this, I felt the loss before I had a name for it. And I stayed. For months, I stayed. Because I wasn't ready to be a man who had given everything only to be left with nothing. But in the end, it wasn't a fight that made me leave. There were no raised voices. No slammed doors. Just a morning like any other. She stood by the sink, pouring coffee for herself. No second mug. No glance in my direction. I watched her in that moment and thought, she's already gone. All that's left is the shadow. So I left before I disappeared too. And that's how it began. Not with a scream, but with silence. And the silence was deafening. There's a strange heaviness that settles into a house when love begins to vanish. It's not sudden like people think. It doesn't come crashing in. It seeps through the cracks. Slowly. Quietly. And the scariest part is how quickly you learn to live with it. After I left that morning, I didn't go far. Just to a small motel about 40 minutes outside of town, the kind of place people pass by without seeing. It smelled faintly of bleach and wet carpet, but it had a window that overlooked a rusted chain-link fence and a vending machine that didn't work, and for some reason, that felt like the right place to be. Nothing asked questions. Nothing expected answers. It was exactly what I needed. I didn't leave her a note. I didn't pack much. A duffel bag, my old watch, my truck keys, and the shirt she once called her favorite on me, back when she still used words like that. I didn't leave to hurt her. I left because staying had started to erase me. Day by day. Word by word. I was becoming someone smaller, a version of myself that only existed to avoid upsetting her silence. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I sat on the edge of that motel bed and stared at my hands like they didn't belong to me. And all I could think about was how long I had waited for her to notice I was slipping away. The irony, of course, was that she had slipped first, and I had stayed, holding out hope like it was my only oxygen. The first 3 days were the hardest. I kept expecting a call, a message, even a knock at the door. But nothing came. No search. No panic. No questions. It was like I had quietly been erased from her world, just as I had feared. I checked my phone obsessively. Turned the ringer up. Then off. Then back on again. Nothing. And that silence hurt worse than any shouted goodbye ever could. On the 5th day, I drove back to the neighborhood, not to go inside, but just to see if she was still there. Her car was in the driveway, porch light on, the curtains in the living room drawn halfway, just like always. It all looked unchanged, like I'd never existed in that space to begin with. But something broke in me as I sat there watching our house from across the street. Not rage, not even heartbreak. Something else, something deeper. I realized I had been so desperate to be seen by her, to be chosen again, that I had completely forgotten to choose myself. And for the first time in over a year, I did. I turned off my phone. Not forever. Just for a while. I took a job in a smaller town doing renovations on old properties, something I used to love before the relationship made everything feel like a sacrifice. The owner, a woman named Etta, gave me a key to a small cottage near the woods that had been abandoned for years. I spent every day rebuilding it, stripping it down to the bones, piece by piece. Hammer in hand, nails in my pocket, music playing low through an old speaker I hadn't used since my 20s. It was hard work, honest work. And in a strange way, it mirrored everything I was going through. Taking something that had been slowly falling apart and finding out if there was anything left worth saving. I stopped checking social media. Stopped asking mutual friends how she was. I didn't want to know, not because I didn't care, but because I knew hearing she was fine without me would set me back months. And if she wasn't fine, I didn't trust myself not to go back. And that's when it began, the real healing. Not the kind people talk about on podcasts or in self-help books. Not the kind where you work on yourself in some spa in the mountains. No, this was the kind of healing that comes from waking up alone and learning not to hate it. From making dinner for one and realizing it still matters how it tastes. From walking into an empty house and not mistaking silence for failure. It took time. It took longer than I'd ever admit out loud. But piece by piece, I rebuilt something inside me. And then, one morning almost a year after I left, the message came. It wasn't long. Just 7 words, typed out at 6:17 a.m. Are you happy now that I'm not? I stared at the screen. The number was still the same. The name too. It had been 321 days since she last said my name out loud. And now, she reached for it again, not with softness, not with grace, but with regret. But I didn't reply. Not out of bitterness. Not out of pride. I just knew. She was too late. And that was the moment I realized. I had truly left. Not just the house. Not just the marriage. But the version of myself that begged to be loved by someone who had already let go. There's something ironic about realizing your greatest growth came from the very thing that almost broke you. I didn't set out to rebuild my life out of spite. There was no grand declaration, no revenge plan, no need to prove her wrong. It wasn't about her at all. That was the shift. For the first time in years, the center of my decisions wasn't someone else's disappointment, someone else's silence, someone else's love being held just out of reach. It was me. Just me. In the beginning, I still carried her ghost everywhere. I'd reach for 2 cups in the morning. Set a second pillow on the bed out of habit. I kept the passenger seat clean in case she'd suddenly call and ask if we could talk, as if the universe owed us some dramatic moment of clarity. But time, when given space, is honest. And eventually, her absence stopped echoing through everything. The phantom pain dulled. I worked every day. Some jobs paid little, some paid enough. The cottage I'd been fixing up became more than shelter. It became a reflection of myself. It started cold, creaky, and neglected, floors warped from years of water damage, walls stained with time. I'd spend hours sanding old wood, filling in the cracks, scraping off layers of someone else's paint. At some point, I realized that's exactly what I'd been doing with myself too. Scraping off layers she'd left behind, old habits, old fears, old apologies. I remember one day clearly. I had just finished restoring the front door, solid maple, deep red finish, and I stood back and looked at it like it was some kind of masterpiece. I ran my hand across the wood, and I whispered to no one, "You're allowed to come home to something that doesn't hurt." It wasn't about a house. It was about me. For years, I had walked on eggshells in my own marriage. I became smaller so she wouldn't feel threatened. Softer, quieter. I learned how to predict her moods before she spoke. And still, it was never enough. There was always something just out of reach, some look she gave other people that I hadn't seen in years, some tone in her voice she reserved for strangers but never gave me anymore. I used to wonder what I had done wrong, what I failed to be. But the truth is, love isn't something you should have to earn over and over just to be seen. As weeks passed, the town began to feel familiar. The barista at the local coffee shop remembered my name. A retired mechanic named Lloyd showed me how to sharpen my tools the old-fashioned way. A neighbor named Elise brought fresh bread on Sundays, even when I insisted she didn't have to. These people didn't know my past. They didn't care who I had been. They only knew the man who showed up each morning with tired eyes and a quiet hello. That was enough. One afternoon, I was painting the window trim when I saw a car slow down in front of the house. A black SUV. Tinted windows. It paused, then kept going. My stomach clenched before my mind even caught up. It was instinct, the kind of dread you don't forget once you've been betrayed. That night, I checked my phone for the first time in weeks. I had a new message. It wasn't from her directly. It was from her sister, Camille. She's not doing great. Just thought you should know. I sat with that message for nearly an hour before turning the phone off again. What was I supposed to do with that? She hadn't called me when she felt me disappearing. She hadn't reached out when I begged with my silence. But now, after all this time, I was supposed to reappear just because the weight of her choices had finally landed? The truth was, and it felt strange even thinking it, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't even feel sad. I felt distant, detached, like her storm could no longer reach me. Because in that moment, standing in the middle of a house I built with my own hands, surrounded by quiet I had chosen, I realized something so simple and so powerful it made me sit down and laugh for the first time in months. I had healed in a way she never got to see. And that was enough. It was late fall when she finally came. I didn't expect it. I hadn't even allowed myself to imagine it. But there she was, standing outside the cottage in a long coat, arms folded tightly across her chest like she didn't know if she was here to ask or apologize. I had just come back from a job on the east side of town, saw her car before I saw her face. And when I pulled up the gravel path and stepped out, there was this long, aching second where we just looked at each other. Like two people meeting in the ruins of something they used to believe in. Lorna. Still as striking as I remembered, but there was something dimmer in her expression, like even her confidence had thinned. She said my name like it was both a question and a plea, and I just nodded. I didn't speak. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to hear what version of herself she brought with her. She glanced toward the cottage, toward the porch I had rebuilt by hand, toward the windows I had reframed, toward the life I had built slowly, steadily, without her. And she said the words I think she rehearsed the entire drive here. I didn't know how far gone we were until it was quiet. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. But her voice had that tremble I remembered from the rare nights when she used to open up, the kind that made her human again, not the distant shell I had left behind. I invited her in, not because I owed her that, but because I needed to see who I'd become and how different I felt with her standing in my space instead of hers. The moment she stepped inside, she paused. The house didn't smell like the life we had. No more lavender candles. No polished marble countertops. It smelled like cedar, fresh paint, and something grounded. Real. She looked at the stack of firewood by the hearth, the books scattered on the coffee table, the mug left drying by the sink. A man lives here. A man who stayed, even when no one else did. She sat on the edge of the couch, and I could see her hands fidgeting. She wasn't used to not being in control anymore. Then she finally said it, soft, deliberate, almost like it hurt her to form the words. I was selfish. I thought you'd never leave. And I believed her. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. I don't think she ever expected me to walk away. I think she mistook my silence for surrender. Thought I would just keep showing up, even when she stopped meeting me halfway. She admitted she had confused my loyalty with weakness. That somewhere deep inside, she had assumed I'd always choose her, even when she no longer chose me. She told me about the man. Not his name, not the details, just enough. She said she'd been lost, bored, numb. Said it wasn't about him. That he didn't matter. That it ended quickly, but the damage lingered long after. I didn't ask for more. I didn't want more. Because this wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about everything that happened after. She asked if I hated her. I told her no. I never did. That was the truth. What I felt for her had once been too deep for hate. But love isn't a permanent structure. It's a living thing. It either grows or it dies. And by the time I left, ours had already collapsed quietly in the background, long before either of us had the courage to say it out loud. She looked around the room again, almost wistful. I thought I'd find you broken, she said. But you're not. And she was right. I wasn't. I had found peace in small things, a working sink, a quiet breakfast, a life that didn't revolve around trying to earn someone's attention. I had stopped trying to be perfect for someone who didn't know what I was worth until I was already gone. She asked if there was someone new. I told her there wasn't. Not yet. but that I hoped there would be. And that when that person came, I'd be ready, not as a man trying to fix a broken heart, but as someone who had rebuilt himself from the inside out. Lorna stood up slowly, brushed her coat flat, and gave me the kind of look I hadn't seen from her in years. It wasn't longing. It wasn't hope. It was grief, not for me, but for the version of me she had taken for granted. She finally saw the life she was never going to be part of again. Before she left, she asked me one last thing. Do you ever think we'll find our way back? I didn't answer with words. I just stepped aside and let her walk out of the house. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go after they've already let you go long ago. After Lorna left that day, I didn't feel triumphant. There wasn't some inner celebration. No fireworks of validation. Just a stillness, wide and unmoving, the kind that comes only after years of noise. She had looked me in the eye and seen something she didn't recognize anymore. That was the most painful truth for her, I think. She had expected to return to the same version of me, still waiting, still wounded, still open. But I wasn't him anymore. I hadn't been for a long time. That version of me died quietly in the space between her silence and my patience. She had come to see if there was a door still cracked open. But she found a home she no longer had a key to. The days after her visit were strange. Not sad, exactly, but tender. Everything around me felt louder. The birds at the edge of the woods, the creak of the back steps, the kettle boiling in the kitchen. It was like I was re-entering my own life with a new pair of ears. And that silence I had once hated? It no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like peace. I started to notice the small victories. The way I could fall asleep without tension in my chest. The fact that I no longer rehearsed fake conversations in the shower. I stopped imagining what I'd say if she ever showed up, because she had, and I had said everything I needed to without trying. And what's strange, maybe even poetic, is that around this time, people started showing up in my life for real. Not ghosts of the past, but real, grounded souls who didn't know me as a husband or a man someone left. They knew me as Corbin, the guy who worked with his hands, who laughed too quietly, who helped his neighbor install a new fence just because it looked like he needed the company. One of those people was Isla. She worked at the used bookstore in town, the one with creaky floors and a sleepy golden retriever that napped in the poetry aisle. I met her because I needed a copy of The Old Man and the Sea. I remembered reading it once during a hurricane when I was 15, and for some reason, it had started echoing in my mind again. She rang it up without small talk. But I noticed her hands, ink-smudged, a little cracked, like she worked with paper and paint and didn't care much for gloves. She seemed like someone who didn't chase attention and didn't give it carelessly either. I respected that. Weeks passed before we spoke again. Then one afternoon, she mentioned that the back wall of the store had a leak. She knew I did restoration. Asked if I could take a look. I said sure. Fixing it only took a few hours, but she brought me coffee, and we talked. Slowly. Gently. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. We spoke about music, and how her father once told her silence was sacred, and how people often fill it too quickly. She said she liked slow things. Slow food. Slow books. Slow people. That stuck with me. We became friends, in the real sense of the word. No tension, no flirting. Just presence. And one day, sitting on a bench outside the shop as the sky turned violet, she said something that stopped me cold. You carry yourself like someone who chose to rebuild instead of collapse. It was the first time anyone had put it into words. Not, you're doing great now, or you've moved on, or you've healed. No. It was something deeper, a recognition. That somewhere between the silence and the ruin, I had made a decision. Not out of anger. Not to prove her wrong. But because I had to live with myself, and I couldn't do that in pieces anymore. That night, I sat in my cottage and lit a single candle, something I hadn't done since the early days with Lorna. But this time, it wasn't hers. It was mine. My space. My moment. And as the wax melted slowly into the glass, I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I already was. I didn't know what the future held. Whether Isla would become something more or simply pass through my life like a gentle visitor. I didn't know if Lorna would ever text again. But for the first time in a long, long time, I didn't need answers. Because I was no longer asking questions that depended on someone else's love to define me. I had found my own. Quiet. Steady. Honest. And that was everything. There's a moment, not loud, not obvious, where the past stops being a wound and becomes a story. I felt that shift on a late November afternoon, the kind where the wind drags leaves in slow spirals across the gravel, and the sky seems permanently stuck between silver and gold. I had just finished cleaning out the crawlspace beneath the cottage, sorting through things I hadn't touched since I moved in. Extra nails, bent tools, a photo frame I meant to hang but never did. In the very back corner, tucked behind a box of old tarp, I found a scarf. Hers. I didn't even remember packing it. It was deep green with tiny embroidered dots along the edge. She wore it the last fall we were still pretending everything was okay. I remember the way it used to trail behind her in the wind, like something alive, something that refused to settle. I sat with it for a long time, fingers curled around the threads, and for the first time in months, I let myself remember her without bitterness. Because the truth is, Lorna wasn't a villain. She was just someone who changed, who made choices I couldn't follow her through. And maybe I changed too. Maybe I became quieter. Maybe I became easier to overlook. But in the end, we became people who couldn't find each other in the dark anymore. I folded the scarf carefully and put it in a drawer I rarely open, not out of nostalgia, not because I wanted to hold on to her, but because I had made peace with the part of me that still remembered who we once were. And you don't have to erase someone to move on. You just have to stop letting them take up space in the room you built for your future. The cottage had become something of a second skin to me. The walls smelled like cedar and earth, the kind of scent that makes you feel like you've been rooted in one place long enough to belong to it. The fireplace cracked quietly in the evenings, and sometimes I'd fall asleep with a book on my chest and music humming low from the kitchen. There was no performance anymore, no anxious waiting for someone to text back, no wondering what my words would cost. Just breath. Just being. And still, without trying, Isla had become a part of my days. Not because either of us pushed, but because something in her felt familiar in a way that didn't scare me. We shared silences that didn't need filling. She brought me poems sometimes, old, yellowed pages with underlines in pencil, and never told me what they meant to her. She let me find out for myself. I never asked her about her past. She never asked me about mine. There was a mutual understanding that we had both come through something. That maybe the way we sipped our tea too slowly or watched the horizon too long was less about distraction and more about reverence. We had learned how fragile peace could be, and neither of us was in a hurry to disturb it. One evening, she brought soup. Said she made too much. We sat on the floor because I hadn't finished building the dining chairs, and the table was still just a stack of salvaged wood and blueprints. She told me about the sound the bookstore made at night when the heater kicked on and how it reminded her of her grandmother's house. And I told her about the time I built a treehouse when I was 10 using nothing but crooked nails and blind optimism. When she left, she paused at the door. She didn't lean in. She didn't linger with hope. She just said, "You make the silence feel kind." I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of restlessness, but because that sentence kept repeating in my mind like a new rhythm. I had spent years filling silence with apology, with compromise, with explanations. And now someone saw that silence as softness, as strength. I didn't know what that meant yet. Whether she and I were slowly becoming something more or simply two kindred spirits passing through each other's lives in a quiet season. But I didn't need to know. I wasn't searching anymore. I was just here. One night, as winter began brushing at the edge of town, I stood on the porch watching the trees shiver. I thought about how easy it is to lose yourself in someone else when you don't know who you are without them. How you can love someone so much you start to vanish under their moods, their distance, their unmet expectations. But not this time. This time, I had stayed with myself. Through the grief, through the stillness, through the awkward, silent dinners and the long walks with no destination. I didn't rush the pain. I didn't mask it with someone new. I sat in it, and I learned from it. And that, I think, is the difference between starting over and truly healing. Starting over is just a reaction. But healing? Healing is an act of quiet rebellion, of choosing not to repeat the same story simply because it's familiar. That night, I lit the fireplace, set a mug of tea beside the chair I built, and sank into the warmth of something I hadn't felt in years. Not love. Not yet. But peace. And that was enough to carry me forward. Sometimes the biggest revelations arrive without sound. No bang. No breakdown. Just a shift, like the moment you realize the house isn't creaking anymore because the wind finally died down. I had one of those moments on a day that didn't seem important, standing in the middle of the grocery store, staring at a jar of blueberry preserves. Lorna used to love those. Not the cheap kind. The fancy imported ones with the gold lids and handwritten style labels. I used to pick them up without thinking. Second nature. But that day, standing there in front of the shelf, I reached for the jar, and my hand froze. Not because of some swell of nostalgia or pain, but because I realized I didn't want it anymore. That moment hit me harder than her apology. It was the clearest signal that I wasn't carrying her habits anymore. I wasn't keeping parts of her alive out of muscle memory. My choices were becoming mine again. From the way I brewed my coffee to the way I folded my t-shirts, nothing I did now had to be filtered through the question, would she like this? The cottage had changed too, subtly but completely. It was no longer the place I fled to. It had grown into something new, something I chose. Every nail I drove into the wall, every piece of reclaimed wood I refinished, every plant I kept alive longer than I used to think I could. It was all proof that I was still here, that I could make something of my own and watch it stay. And Isla, well, she didn't force her way into my life. She walked gently into it. Some days she wouldn't text. Some days she'd bring a book she thought I'd like and say nothing as she left it on the porch. I never knew what to expect with her, and maybe that's why it felt so safe. There were no patterns to fall into, no emotional debt to pay. She didn't need me to be anyone other than who I was, which, honestly, was still something I was figuring out. I don't think I knew how to exist in a space where no one expected me to fix anything. Lorna used to look at me like I was a problem to be solved or a project to finish. She loved the version of me that showed up to do what needed to be done. The steady hand, the peacemaker, but not the man who had questions. Not the one who had bad days. Not the one who didn't always have the words ready. But Isla didn't look at me like I was broken or brilliant. She just looked. There was a night, late December, where I invited her inside. No reason. No agenda. Just two people tired of talking with the cold wind between them. I made soup. She brought wine. And for the first time in years, I set two places at the table without flinching. We talked about music, about trees, about how she once lived in a cabin in Vermont and used to sing to the snow, believing it made it fall heavier. I told her about the night I slept in my truck during a thunderstorm just to be away from home. Not my proudest moment, but maybe one of the most honest. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask why, just nodded, then said, "Some people live their entire lives trying to be wanted. Others finally learn how to be whole." That sentence wrapped around my ribs like a warm scarf. We didn't touch that night. No slow fade into something romantic. No dramatic first kiss. Just two people sharing quiet like it was sacred. I didn't want to rush into something that looked like comfort but was really just fear in disguise. I'd done that before. So had she. She left just before midnight, and before she did, she stood at the door and whispered, "You don't owe anyone the old version of you." And then she was gone. And that was the first time I truly smiled without guilt. I sat by the fire afterward, the warmth brushing my ankles, and thought about how long I'd been carrying versions of myself just to survive the past. The agreeable one. The steady one. The forgivable one. I had become a shape molded to another person's comfort, and forgotten I was meant to be a person with shape of his own. Love, real love, I was starting to believe, wasn't about becoming someone for someone else. It was about being exactly who you are, and letting someone sit beside that truth without trying to rearrange it. And if I ever fell in love again, it wouldn't be with someone who needed saving. It would be with someone who saw me whole, even if I wasn't finished yet. That night, I took a walk in the snow. No phone. No coat. Just me and the cold and the sound of my boots pressing into fresh powder. The stars were sharp above, and for the first time, I looked up and didn't feel small. I felt free. And I wasn't afraid of what came next. Spring came slowly to the town, the kind of spring that doesn't arrive all at once, but in pieces. One morning the air stopped biting. A week later, the trees along the ridge started blooming like they'd remembered something ancient. And inside me, something thawed too. Not all at once, not in some movie scene epiphany, but gradually, deliberately, like it was waiting for permission. The cottage looked different now. Warmer. Lived in. There were paintbrushes in a mason jar by the window, a blanket draped across the couch that didn't match anything else, and a stack of worn books I hadn't read yet but liked having nearby. I had built shelves, sanded the floor, even learned how to fix the stubborn drawer in the kitchen that used to stick. But the biggest change wasn't what you could see, it was what no longer echoed. I didn't wake up waiting for a text anymore. I didn't carry the weight of questions that had no answers. I didn't look out the window wondering if someone was coming back. I had stopped waiting and started living. Isla became a part of that quietly, without needing to be announced. We never had a moment. No declarations. Just a series of days where she showed up, and I noticed I wasn't bracing for disappointment anymore. We planted a garden behind the cottage in early April. Tomatoes, mostly. Some wildflowers, too. She said she liked watching things grow. I told her I was still learning how to believe in that again. One afternoon, as we sat with dirt under our nails and the smell of earth between us, she reached over, took my hand, and said, "I'm not here to rewrite your story, Corbin. I just want to walk beside the pages you haven't written yet." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in years, I knew the story was mine. Not hers. Not ours. Mine. And it was a good one. Lorna never came back again after that winter. I don't know where she is now. I don't feel bitterness when I think of her. I hope she's found whatever it was she went looking for. I hope she's forgiven herself. Because I have. And that's not something I ever thought I'd be able to say. Forgiveness, it turns out, isn't about excusing what hurt you. It's about no longer letting it define you. Now, when people ask if I've moved on, I smile. Not because I've buried what happened. Not because I pretend it didn't change me. But because I know now moving on isn't about leaving pain behind. It's about carrying it differently. Knowing it shaped you, but not letting it shape everything. And as I sit here, writing this with the windows open, the breeze carrying the scent of those wildflowers we planted months ago, I can say this without hesitation. I'm happy. Not in a loud, dramatic way. Not in a way that demands to be seen. But in the way that matters most. Quietly. Consistently. Fully. This is what I learned. When someone stops choosing you, don't beg them to stay. Choose yourself. Choose peace over noise. Choose honesty over comfort. Choose stillness over chasing. And when the right person comes, they won't ask you to shrink. They'll help you grow. They'll see you not as who you used to be, but as who you are now and who you're becoming. That's what Isla did for me. That's what I finally did for myself. And that, in the end, was the real beginning.